Last lecture, we heard some compelling arguments for thinking that determinism is incompatible with the ability to act otherwise. Only by ignoring or denying the evidence, it seems, can we maintain a belief in free will. But what if we've been working with the wrong definition of free will? Some philosophers, called compatibilists, suggest just that, and argue that if we understand free will correctly, the notion that humans are free becomes defensible. So this raises the question, what does it really mean to be free? Now, one way for determinism and free will to be compatible is if free will does not really require alternate possibilities. Many compatibilists believe this, and we'll consider their arguments shortly. But first, let's look at the arguments of another group of compatibilists. Compatibilists who admit that free will does indeed require alternate possibilities, but who suggest instead that determinism is not incompatible with alternate possibilities after all. The argument that determinism and alternate possibilities are incompatible was most famously articulated by Carl Ginnett and dubbed by Peter Van Inwagen the consequence argument. It posits that if determinism is true, there's only one possible future. Since the past has already occurred, and since determinism entails that the laws of nature causally necessitate only one possible outcome of past facts, it seems that there's only one possible future. There are no alternate possibilities. Past facts plus laws of nature equal only one possible future. But some compatibilists, like David Lewis and John Martin Fisher, insist that the consequence argument is unsound. That even in a deterministic universe, there are alternate possibilities. Their argument basically goes something like this. Despite the fact that one and only one future is causally determined, it's still the case that other futures are possible. They're just possible in a different sense of the word. An agent acting otherwise is still possible because agents have the power to have acted otherwise. Why? Because if the agent had chosen to act differently than they actually did, they would have. Fisher specifically suggests that if the agent had chosen to do otherwise, the past would have been different than it is. So, even when the facts of the past combined with the laws entail that agent A will perform action X, it's still the case that agent A could have acted otherwise, because if he did, the past would have been different than it is. Notice, this is very akin to one of the responses to the freedom for knowledge problem that we discussed a few lectures ago, the backtracking counterfactual objection. Remember, it suggested that even though God already had an infallible belief about what you will do, you can still do otherwise, because if you were to do otherwise, God would have had a different belief than he did. In the same way, it's true that if I were to act in a way different than is causally necessitated by past facts and the laws of nature, then the past facts would be different than they are. But, sadly, this objection misses the point. It's true that acting differently would entail that the past would be different. The problem is that the past can no longer be different than it is. In order to be free, according to what's called the libertarian notion of free will, acting otherwise must now be a real possibility, right now, a real possibility. But since if determinism is true, acting otherwise would require the past to be different than it is, which is now impossible, then acting otherwise is not a genuine possibility. Think of it this way. Is it possible for Hitler to have won World War II? Well, of course, if events had gone differently than they did. So, in a certain kind of way, it's possible for the past to have been different than it is. I can imagine it having gone differently. But is it possible right now for Hitler to have won World War II? Does anyone can have control over that fact? Does anyone have the power to make the proposition Hitler won World War II true right now? Of course not. So, in a much more robust way, no other past but the one that has occurred is possible. No other past is now possible. What the libertarian definition of free will suggests is that in order to be free, we must have the ability to do otherwise in the robust way. Both performing action X and not performing action X must be a real, genuine possibility. Both options must be something that one now has the power to bring about. If doing otherwise is only something that I can imagine, then I can't really do otherwise, and thus I'm not free. So in my opinion, the strategy of defending compatibilism by arguing that determinism is compatible with alternate possibilities is a dead end. It basically involves redefining what it means to be able to do otherwise as something so thin that it cannot rightfully ground a robust notion of free will. For this reason, I usually think of compatibilism as an effort to redefine what it means to be free, by suggesting that free will does not require alternate possibilities. But maybe there are good reasons to think that free will doesn't require possibilities. For example, P.F. Strawson suggests that whether or not a person is morally responsible for his action, and in turn whether his action is free, is determined by the reaction of his community to his action. If they judge him to be morally responsible and free, well, then he is. And they will do this even if determinism is true and there are no alternate possibilities. As we've discussed, the notion that we're free and morally responsible for our actions is about as unavoidable as anything can be. We can't help but think that. If an agent's freedom is determined by the judgment of his community, and the community would still judge him to be free, even if determinism is true, then it seems that determinism and free will must be compatible. But suggesting that an agent's free will is dependent upon the reaction of a community seems a bit shaky. After all, isn't whether I am free in the metaphysical sense we're discussing a metaphysical fact independent of the opinion of others? It's not subjective. If I'm free, then I'm free, regardless of what you or anyone else thinks. It's not a question that can be answered with a sociological survey, right? Thankfully, the philosopher Harry Frankfurt gives us an objective reason for rejecting the libertarian notion that free will requires alternate possibilities. It comes in the form of a thought experiment. Actually, the original example was about why moral responsibility doesn't require alternate possibilities. Since moral responsibility and libertarian free will seem to go hand in hand, the arguments get mixed up sometimes. And over the years, Frankfurt's example has been tweaked many times. So let me just give you my version. All right. Imagine a person, Oswald, who has an opportunity to kill another person, Kennedy. Let's say Oswald will have Kennedy in the sights of his rifle and will have the opportunity to kill Kennedy by deciding to pull the trigger. But suppose that there is an evil Russian neuroscientist who wants to make sure that Kennedy dies. So the evil neuroscientist plants a machine in Oswald's brain to monitor his brain activity to make sure that Oswald will kill Kennedy when the time comes. If the machine detects that Oswald is about to pull the trigger on his own, well, then the machine will do nothing. But if it sees that Oswald is about to not pull the trigger, then the machine will kick in and it will make his neurons fire in such a way that he will pull the trigger. Now, it seems that Oswald's failure to kill Kennedy is not possible. If he's about to fail to do so, the machine will kick in and make him do it. Yet, if the machine never kicks in, it will be because Oswald freely chooses to kill Kennedy on his own. And surely that is possible. So it seems it is possible for Oswald to freely choose to kill Kennedy, even though it's not possible for him to do otherwise. Thus, it seems that free will does not require alternate possibilities. Although initially convincing, in my view, such counterexamples fail to demonstrate that alternate possibilities are not required for free will, at least in the robust sense. First of all, most philosophers agree that, correctly understood, the notion that free will requires alternate possibilities should be expressed in terms of one's ability to choose otherwise, not merely do otherwise. Further, I have argued that the ability to choose otherwise amounts to one being able to not choose as they will. Specifically, I suggest that for agent A to freely choose to do action X, it must be possible for agent A to not choose to do action X. Notice that in Frankfurt-style counterexamples, it's possible for the agent in question to not choose to do the action in question. It's possible for the machine to kick in, and if it does, then Oswald does not choose to kill Kennedy. The machine is making him do it. The machine chooses for him. If any person is doing the choosing at that point, it's the evil Russian neuroscientist. So, even in the example, the libertarian requirements for free will are met, at least in the way that I articulate them. The agent not choosing to do action X is possible. Thus, previous examples are not counterexamples to libertarian free will. Yet, that only means that Frankfurt counterexamples don't prove that compatibilism is right. But it still could be. So, for the sake of argument, let's assume that compatibilism is right, that it's true, that alternate possibilities are not required for free will. Let's assume that even when performing an action is inevitable, it can still be the case that you perform that action freely. Now, this might seem to be an ad hoc move, right? Now that free will is on shaky ground, we're just redefining free will so we can continue to say that we still believe in it. But in fact, many argue that Aristotle embraced compatibilism. And if so, this notion of free will is pretty much as old as the debate itself, so it's not an ad hoc move at all. But why wouldn't free will require alternate possibilities? Well, the central claim of the compatibilist is that all that's required for an agent to freely perform an action is for that action to somehow be driven or drive or be motivated by some component of the agent. The simplest way to think about it is in terms of wants and desires. A compatibilist might suggest that you perform an action freely as long as you do so in response to your wants and desires. If you choose to eat pizza for lunch because you want to eat pizza for lunch, then you freely chose to eat pizza for lunch. This notion, however, is somewhat simplistic. After all, cigarette smokers may want another cigarette, but if they're addicted, it's hard to say that they choose to smoke that cigarette freely. Frankfurt handles this by articulating his understanding of free will in terms of second-order wants and desires. That is, in terms of a person's desires about their desires. So, suppose a smoker wants to quit. She wishes she didn't have the desire to smoke. Then she has second-order desire, a desire about a desire. If she ignores her next craving, Frankfurt would say she acts freely. If she does give in to her craving, acting in accordance with her first-order desire, then she's not acting freely. But if she acts in accordance with her second-order desire to quit smoking, that is what makes it acting freely. That's what it takes to act freely. Other compatibilists make different suggestions about what is required for free will. Philosophers Daniel Dennett and John Martin Fisher have developed a version of compatibilism that defines freedom in terms of responsiveness to reason. Roughly put, if a decision is reached as a process of a reasonable deliberation, the action is said to be free. Of course, Fisher and Dinnett's theories differ on important points. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to explore them. The nice thing is that it's very easy to defend the notion that humans have free will in a compatibilist sense. Many of the challenges to libertarian free will simply don't hold water when applied to compatibilism. For example, even if the behavior of our brains is deterministic, causally determined by the laws of physics, that doesn't mean that we can't be free in the compatibilist sense. It can still be the case that my actions are a consequence of my second-order desires or rational deliberation, even if it's the case that my rational deliberation could not have ended any other way, or my second-order desires could not have produced anything else. Now, compatibilistic free will may still be threatened by the previously mentioned neuroscientific experiments. It's difficult to maintain that actions stem from conscious operations like second-order desires and rational deliberations if, in fact, they stem from unconscious parts of our brain. But more study is clearly needed. The biggest problem, in my opinion, for compatibilism is that it just doesn't track with most people's intuitions about what it means to be free. Suppose, for example, that I built a robot and programmed it to have certain wants and desires, and certain second-order wants and desires, and to always act in accordance with second-order wants and desires after a rational deliberation. So everything the robot does would ultimately be a result of me programming it. Does that robot act freely? It seems not. Yet, according to the compatibilist definition, it does, because it acts in accordance with its second-order wants and desires after a rational deliberation. In reality, it seems the robot is not to blame or praise for anything it does. I am, because I programmed it. Yet, according to the compatibilist definition, the robot is free and morally responsible for everything it does. This is problematic because our biology suggests that we are like the robot, programmed by our genetics and environment to behave a certain way. And ultimately, it's all outside of our control. That program is given to us just like I gave it to the robot. Yes, my programmer wasn't another person, my DNA and environment, but that's irrelevant. If how I behave is not up to me, if my behavior is causally explained by something outside of me, the agent, then it seems that I am not free. And if my wants and desires were given to me by my environment and genetics, the causal explanation for my actions is explained by something outside of me. Now, for compatibilism, this doesn't matter. The causal explanation for your action could trace all the way back to the beginning of the universe. But as long as you are involved at some point, you'd be free. But again, this seems wrong. I, the agent, need to be the causal explanation for the action if it is to be free. So it seems that compatibilism falls short. But the notion that I need to cause my actions for them to be free leads us to our next theory of free will, agent causation. Despite its name, agent causation does not merely suggest that an action is free if it's caused by an agent. In reality, most agent causation theorists are also libertarians. They think free will requires alternate possibilities. The reason they're also agent causation theorists is because they believe that the only way for there to be alternate possibilities is if one's actions are caused by oneself. Consequently, agent causation theorists are usually not compatibilists. But since this is a lecture on compatibilism, I'd like to consider a version of agent causation that is compatibilistic. It's a view that ultimately suggests that in order for an action to be free and for one to be morally responsible for that action, all that's required is that the action be caused by the agent, and that an action can be caused by an agent even if determinism is true. It's a view persuasively argued for by Ned Markosian. Markosian begins by observing that we need not think of agents in a dualistic sense, as some kind of soul or mind that exists independent of one's body. An agent is simply a person, and we can identify persons with their bodies. Now, later we'll return to the issue of what exactly persons are and whether they can be so identified. But for now, I think we can intuitively make sense of what it means for a person to cause an event without having to appeal to dualism. He asks us to imagine two girls, Manon and Kira, both throwing a ball to hit a target to dunk Haley at the state fair. Suppose Kira throws first, but Manon throws faster. She throws second, but throws faster so that their balls hit the target at the same time. It would be correct to say that the event of Haley's dunking was caused by an event outside of Kira, the event of Manon's ball hitting the target. But it would be wrong to say that Kira didn't freely cause the event herself. Even in the event of double causation, where an action is also caused by an outside force, we would still say that the agent in question freely chose to do the action and is morally responsible for it. The same would be true if an agent chooses to pass the salt in response to someone requesting that the salt be passed. By all meaningful accounts of causation, asking for the salt is what caused it to be passed, yet we would still say the agent causes the salt to be passed and does so freely. Double causation, it seems, does not prevent an action from being freely chosen, even when this double causation is really robust. Suppose that, like in the Kennedy-Oswald example before, someone implants a device in Oswald's brain, but this one makes sure that he won't chicken out by making it physically determined that Kennedy will be shot. It's still the case that if Oswald chooses to shoot Kennedy on his own, he did so freely, even though the event of Kennedy being shot was physically necessitated by outside events. Or, suppose you have an outstanding character and feel obligated to help people in need. So one day when you come across a burning building, you find that you can't resist causing yourself to go in and rescue people. Do you not still get moral credit for doing so? It would seem so, but how can you get moral credit unless you acted freely? And this seems true even if the good character you have is not solely a result of your efforts. All in all, Marcosian suggests that an action is morally free if and only if that action is caused by an agent, even if that action can also be said to be caused by events or forces outside of the agent. So Marcosian's view still jibes with the intuition that in order for an action to be free, it must be caused by an agent. It just rejects the view that the agent must be the only cause of the action. In order for an action to be free, a causal explanation must be found that traces back and ends in the agent, but it is not necessary that this be the only existing explanation. So Marcosian's theory of agent causation is compatibilistic because it says it's possible for an action to be agent caused and yet also be the only action possible because it was physically necessitated to occur by deterministic forces. Agent causation is possible even in a deterministic world, and thus free will is still possible even in a deterministic world. Ultimately, we might say the best compatibilistic theory goes something like this. Agents are physical bodies, and how those agents behave at a particular moment is dictated by their physical configuration, mainly their brain structure, at that particular moment. And that configuration is determined by their genetics and environment. However, when the agent acts, it's still the case that the agent is the cause of his action. The agent may not be the only cause, but it's not wrong to say that the agent caused the action in question. And as such, it makes sense to say that he is morally responsible for his action, and thus that the action was free. But it still seems that, even if we say a person whose character is determined by his genetics and environment is morally responsible because he is still the cause of his action, it's difficult to feel the same level of moral indignation in the face of immoral behavior. Although it's still true, in the case of cold-blooded murder, that the agent caused the action in question, it's difficult to lay full blame on him if we realize that his behavior was inevitable because his brain was damaged by his environment or made irregular by his genetics. I mean, sure, the reason that he acted that way was because of his character, and so he did it. But if his character was given to him by outside forces and he couldn't have done otherwise, it's hard to blame him for what he did. Although we might still call him free, he is not free in the robust sense that we usually think of when we blame agents for their actions. Perhaps we might say any action caused by an agent is free, but if the reason the agent performed that particular action can be explained by forces outside of his control, then he does not have free will. Free, but doesn't have free will. Okay. I'd like to close this lecture by considering the consequences of admitting that we don't have free will. After all, even if we can't help but feel free, we could collectively admit that this is the way the world is. Humanity itself could embrace the conclusion that we are not free, even though we feel that we are. And doing so would have wide-scoping implications. For example, if we admitted that people don't have free will, that their actions are a result of their brain structure, which is ultimately outside of their control, it would make no sense to hold them morally responsible for their behavior in a robust way. We may not like criminals or want to be around them, but it would be difficult to blame them and hold them responsible for their actions, knowing that there are causal explanations for their behavior that extend far beyond their power. But as it currently stands, especially in the mind of the public, a major justification for punishing criminals for their behavior is the idea that they are morally blameworthy for what they did and thus morally deserving of punishment. You throw someone in jail because they deserve to be locked up. You execute a murderer because they deserve to die. They could, it is assumed, have opted to not do the crime, but they chose to do it anyway, so they're deserving of punishment. This is why it's called the justice system. It hands out justice, what people deserve. But if we admit that there's no free will, and that the explanation for people's behavior extends beyond their influence, we could no longer punish people for that reason. Without free will and moral responsibility, no one would deserve anything. Now, that's not to say that no one could justifiably be locked away for criminal behavior. Moral retribution is not the only justification for locking people away. We could also lock them away because they have proven themselves to be a menace to society. But the jail we lock them in would likely be very different than those we have today. Jails would be rehabilitation centers instead of retribution centers, complete with counseling, education, and job training if we realized that people weren't morally responsible for their crimes. But even that might not last too long. If we do one day finally admit that we do not have free will, it will likely be because neuroscience has so drastically advanced that we can no longer defend the notion of free will in any way. But once we have such advanced knowledge of the brain, we will likely be able to correct any malfunction that leads to criminal behavior with a medical procedure. We could simply correct their faulty neural wiring with brain surgery. Now, I'm not talking about lobotomies, a procedure where a pick is inserted into the forebrain and a portion of the frontal cortex is destroyed. Such procedures were once used on those considered to be incurably insane, especially troublemakers, because it basically rendered them dull and docile, at least in a lot of cases. No, what I'm talking about would not even injure the criminal's brain. We would just discover the way they are neurally miswired and then correct it so they no longer behave that way. We could literally look into the brain of someone like Hannibal Lecter, see why he's a cannibalistic murderer, and then rewrite his neural connections so that he's as peaceful as the Dalai Lama. Now, one might still object that such a procedure is immoral because it interferes with the person's free will. But what free will? We're simply giving the criminal's brain a new cause for its wiring. Instead of his genetics and his environment, now it's the surgery. The criminal no more has free will before or after the surgery than a computer does before or after being reprogrammed. Of course, the same would be true of us, and this leads to the thought that not having free will may dehumanize us. But more likely, it will simply change our understanding of what it means to be human. But the possibility of such surgeries raises another question. Consider one of my favorite films, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. After his lobotomy, McMurphy, played by Jack Nicholson, is lying there, drooling and dumb. And so his friend, Chief Bromden, puts him out of his misery. He holds the pillow over him. He can't stand to see McMurphy live in such a state, so he puts the pillow over his face, mercifully suffocating him, and then dramatically throws the tub room control panel through the window to aid his own escape. But was that really McMurphy he suffocated? McMurphy was a vibrant, funny, intelligent person. But the person Chief suffocated was a drooling idiot. Did Chief really kill McMurphy? Or had the lobotomy already killed him? Likewise, if I took Hannibal Lecter and performed a neural surgery to make him as peaceful as the Dalai Lama, would he really still be Hannibal Lecter? Or would the surgery kill Hannibal and actually create a new person? These questions delve into problems of personal identity. What does it mean to be a person? In virtue of what are you the same person over time? What preserves personal identity? These are among the big questions of philosophy, and exploring them will be key to answering the big question of the next section: could there be an afterlife?